Hello everyone, and welcome to this video that centers around the interdisciplinary literacy practice number 2, employ, develop, and refine schema to understand and create text. I will remind you again, this is appropriate. The strategies and focus that we're doing is appropriate for grades 6 through 12. But I do think it would be good for fourth and fifth grade to actually view the video and look at what we're doing, because some of it is appropriate for them. My name is Carol Mullins, and I'm the KVEC Literacy Instructional Specialist. And with me today is Rebecca King, a high school English teacher at Pikeville High School. Rebecca had the honor of being a part of the Standards and Review and Development Committee for the revisions that have just taken place to our Kentucky Academic Standards for Reading and Writing. So Rebecca has been able to provide a lot of insight into the intent of not only the standards, but also the literacy practices themselves. And I do want to remind you that the literacy practices are not standards. They are considered to be 10 processes, 10 practices that would take place in a classroom that enhances rigor and knowledge in all content areas. So our intent today, again, is first of all, I'm going to take a little bit of time, explain and clarify the intent of the practice. And then Rebecca is going to share a strategy with you that she actually uses with her students and provide you some resources along the way too. So let's go ahead and get started with our learning goal. Our intent today is to build a shared understanding of the fact that activating student schema provides the lens through which they view new information. And I think a lot of us know that, but are we intentional in providing a model or a skill to help kids understand that? It must be done intentionally. It's basically activating prior knowledge, developing new connections, applying specialized vocabulary, and then reflecting on your new understanding. And we as adult educators automatically do that. Anytime anything new is given to us, we try to go back and connect to prior knowledge of what we already know. So sometimes we forget that kids don't automatically do that. We have to set the stage for them to be able to do. Let's talk about clarifying practice number 2. What you see on the screen on the left side is a picture of a brain with files in it, and students really relate to this. When you're telling them that, when you're trying to help them understand and create new text, we're trying to make a connection to what you already know. So your schema are like the file folders in your brain that are the totality of all your experiences, knowledge, emotions, and understanding, which affects what and how we learn. Now, schemas are something that all people possess and continue to form and change throughout their life. When we talk about young children, usually we're talking about it's the patterns of repeated behavior which allow children to explore and express developing ideas and thoughts through their play and exploration. Well, sometimes we forget about that as kids get older, and especially when we're talking about middle and high school, we do what I tend to call jokingly, we commit a suicide. We assume that students learn those things and that they understand how to go back and connect to something they've already learned, when we must, number one, because of adolescence, we must go back and help them remember that. In cognitive science, a schema describes a pattern of thought or behavior that, this next statement is so important, organizes categories of information and the relationships among them. And the reason I stop and say this is the most important, because when we are talking about our composition standards and we're talking about writing, especially on-demand writing, this is the intent of the writing that students should be doing. They will be reading a task and they have to organize categories of information and the relationships among them in order to write a written response, which of course we want at the proficient or distinguished level. And sometimes we give students, we want to just practice on-demand writing, and we want to give them a prompt, and they are not able to go back and pull and organize the information being given to them or make a connection to relationships in order to write about it. So I just want, in clarifying what practice number 2 is asking us to do with our students, is to remember we have to scaffold that process and teach them how to do that prior to giving them a timed or untimed written response. Always go back and remind students how, no matter what they're given to read or to write about, how to make a connection. First thing, go back and make a connection about what you already know. And this is probably most important with grades 6 through 12. I want to share with you, again, pages 384 through 390 in the actual standards document takes each one of the literacy practices and gives you an explanation, with which I've kind of used the terminology that's on this page. But what you see in the boxes are possible teacher actions and possible student actions. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but if you are beginning and you're looking at this, you're ensuring that you provide opportunities for students to experience the literacy practices, which gives them the opportunity to apply them, and they become an innate part of life across the disciplines and even beyond school. In other words, we're trying to help them become literate citizens and knowing how to analyze, interpret, evaluate any situation. So what we're going to do right now, I'm going to transition to Rebecca, and she is going to share the strategy for addressing interdisciplinary literacy practice number 2, which will help kids to employ, develop, and refine schema to understand and create text. And once again, I would like to remind you that this is in all content areas. We're going to make a connection to the reading and writing standards, but as you will see, these will apply in all content areas. So, Rebecca?
Okay, Carol. So the first thing that I like to do before when I'm doing lesson planning and thinking about what I want my students to do, is I always start with a standard and know what standard it is that I want my students to master before I start planning the lesson. And so once I have chosen a standard, and in this case I chose composition, standard 3, which is use narrative strategically in other modes of writing, utilizing effective technique, well-chosen details, and well-structured sequences for an intended purpose, including but not limited to introducing an issue and or supporting a claim. So that was the standard that I was beginning with. And so then the second thing I like to do is think about what literacy practice, what interdisciplinary literacy practice can my students engage in that will help them to reach the rigor of that standard. And so in this case, I chose interdisciplinary literacy practice number 2, because in order for students to use narrative writing especially because my prompt in this case is a personal prompt. The writing assignment that my students were dealing with was write a causal analysis of an event, relationship, or experience which impacted you positively or negatively as a person. So the student's job is to use cause and effect as a pattern of organization. But in order for them to do a causal analysis effectively, it's going to be essential for them to be able to use narration to tell a story of some causal chain about an event, relationship, or experience in their life. So they're going to have to be able to blend those skills in order to do that well. And so one way that students are able to achieve this effectively is if they can connect to schema. If they can delve into what they already have experienced, what they already know, and look at it so that they see a causal relationship, a causal chain.
Yes, and the strategy that Rebecca is using, I get a lot of questions about where narrative writing actually fits. Well, narrative writing, kids must understand these skills that practicing it through narrative writing makes it stronger, and it enhances their ability to write arguments or an informational explanatory written response. So what you're going to see done here in just a few minutes is here is a scaffolding process. Here's a great place to start with students to build the skills that will later be used and are so important in argumentative, informational, explanatory writing.
And so before we started the activity where they're actually engaging in the interdisciplinary literacy practice, I have already taught essentially the pattern of organization of cause and effect, and students have read some model causal analysis, and so they've had some instruction as far as what is a causal analysis and what does that look like. But now they need, in order for them to be able to use narration effectively to discuss a causal chain in their life, they're going to have to be able to connect to schema. And so in order to help them do that and to engage in that literacy practice number 2, I took 3 different free writes essentially that I have acquired over the years from various people, and layered the process so that they first of all just remembered things and engaged in like what have I done and experienced, and then moved into being critical, analyzing that thinking, that remembering. And so I'm going to take you through just a short process here of what we did so that you can see how students can, and this activity is just a 1 class period activity. It's not something that takes a long time, but it's very effective in helping students to get to something that they can actually do a good job with. So the first thing is it's a time travel free write, and I actually got this from Liz Mandrell, who works with the Moorhead Writing Project. So that's where I acquired this free write activity. And so you take students basically back in time. You start with 1 hour ago and you have them write for 2 minutes. What were you doing 1 hour ago? And I'll warn you, they'll look at you like you're crazy when you tell them to do that, but you just tell them to go ahead and write about it. And then you do 1 day ago, then 1 week ago, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, and 10 years ago. And generally, by the time that we've done this process, which just takes about, 12 minutes total, kids will have written a page and a half. Some of them will have written 2.5 pages because they have a lot of stuff that's just sitting there that nobody's asked them to do anything with. And so they just put that on the paper. And I call these free writes because you don't want students to get bogged down in spelling and punctuation and those things. You tell them up front, none of that matters. You're just putting your thoughts on paper. None of that matters. And so you have them do this. So they'll have a substantial amount of writing generally when they finish with this. And then I go to layered journaling, which is another activity. And I actually picked this up from Harriet Scott Chesman, who's an author, and she was my teacher at Breadloaf School of English in Vermont. And so that's where I picked up this idea of layered journaling. She had us do that in a writing class I took with her. And so you have them go back to what they've just written and reread it, and you have them do things. So I have them circle the names of all the people who came up as they were writing. And then I have them think about and write in the margin, are these people still in your life? If not, why not? What happened? Where'd they go? And they just jot notes and circle. Then I have them reread what they've written, and I underline all of the locations that came up as they were writing. And then I ask them, do you still go to these places regularly? And if you don't, what's changed? Why don't you go there? Because, in life, things change, and we don't go to the same places. We don't see the same people. So I have them do that. And then I have them put a box around activities and sports that came up, and do they still do these activities? And if they don't, what's changed? So they just layer that information. A lot of times they'll use a different color pen for that part of the activity, although I don't really make them do that. A lot of them just do, because that's how they roll. And then the third step is, I call this a circle free write activity. And so once they have done the layering, I have them choose one of the people, locations, or activities that changed. One of the things that they circled and wrote about in the layering part. Now, what is always interesting to me is that every time that students do this activity, whatever they circled, like the people are always in there more than once. The same people come up over multiple times, the same locations, the same activities, depending on the student. But most of the time, things don't just come up one time as they go back over that span of years. And so they generally tend to pick something that they circled more than once, though they don't have to. I just say choose one. And so they choose that, and they write it at the top of their page, and they start again. And I time them for 5 minutes, and I tell them, write about this topic. Don't filter what you write, just write whatever comes to mind. Whatever comes into your head, just put it on the paper and get something down. And this is where generally they get to the thing that is going to ultimately turn into their causal analysis. And so once they've done that little 5-minute free write, I have them reflect on what they just wrote. Read it and look for a causal relationship. Can you see how one thing caused something else? And did you get to the why? If you got to the why, you don't go to that place anymore, or the why, you don't see that person, then they have gotten to a causal chain. And so then I tell them, if you got there, then this could be a topic worth exploring in your causal analysis essay. And I did this activity recently with 17 students, and I would say that out of those 17 students, 15 of them, their essays that they turned into me as final drafts, started with this activity. They took it and turned it into a causal analysis.
Before Rebecca finishes up, I just want to point out to you, for so many years with writing portfolios, we were using forms of writing, articles, narratives, those kinds of things. And what you're seeing and hearing is, for example, causal analysis essay. Rebecca is using terminology that you would find in the standards, and also that prepares them for college and career readiness. So we're not focusing necessarily on forms. I always say written responses, but written responses come in many ways. And as the classroom teacher, that's where your expertise comes in, and how you utilize the language of the standards, simply as Rebecca has with a casual analysis essay.
And so, and really, one of the most important skills, I think, especially at 11th and 12th grade, for our students is for them to be able to write a formal academic essay, because that is realistically, if they're going to college, what they're going to need to do. And so a causal analysis essay is something that they're going to have to do later in life. They just are. So we get to the reflection, and then this is something that I think you can see in the example I'm going to show you of a student's work in just a second, is that writing is thinking made visible on paper. And therefore, it is impossible to write well about that which we have not thought critically. And I tell my students this all the time. And I can see a sharp difference in the level of writing I get from students based on topic. If they're writing about something that is personal to them, something that they have firsthand knowledge and experience of, or something that they have researched and studied and are knowledgeable about, their writing is always going to be stronger. And so helping them to have the skills they need to think about something before they start to write is going to be critical, especially for on-demand writing. They're going to be given something that they haven't seen before, and they're going to need to be able to say, okay, what do I know? What do I have locked away that can help me make a personal connection with this topic so that I can write well about it? What have I thought about it before? And has that changed? Is it different? You have to give them those thinking skills. And that's why this literacy practice number 2 is so important to help students do. And so once we went through the reflection, the next step was drafting. And then, of course, my students did a peer review. And I read their papers and gave them feedback. And then they turned in a final draft. And so on this next slide, I want to show you. This is one of my students. This is the circle free write. This is what the student wrote at the bottom of the page. And so I'm just going to read it to you because it's interesting. 10 years ago, I was taken away from my mom and given to my dad permanently. It was a school day, and I was waiting for my mom to pick me up, but she never came. I was the last student there, and after an hour, my grandma came and got me. My mom was dating some drug addict guy, and he was getting chased by the cops. He showed up at my mom's while she was about to leave and come to get me. She was arrested because her boyfriend was there. She was on her way to jail while I was waiting. My dad was given custody that same week. That's why I don't live in the townhouses anymore. Now, the interesting thing about this circle free right here is all of that stuff about the mom and her changed relationship with her. She didn't choose to write about her mom or her dad. She chose to write about why she didn't live in the townhouses anymore. The location. That is how she got to that. And then once it was there, she realized, oh, that's a causal chain. That was a big deal. And she was able to take it. And this is the introductory paragraph of her causal analysis, and you'll see the connection. I stood outside the elementary school waiting for my mother to pick me up on a normal afternoon in 2010. My mother and I lived in one of the townhouses on the hill connected to the University of Pikeville, so I never had to wait longer than 15 minutes for her to pick me up from school. At 3 o'clock, 2 scenarios began playing out. The first was that long day of kindergarten schooling was ending for me. The second was my mother's drug-addicted boyfriend getting into a police chase and leading them to our townhouse where my mom was closing our front door. She was on her way to pick me up. One by one, my classmates were picked up by their parents, and soon there was only a few left. While I was waiting, my mom was getting arrested for her involvement with the boyfriend. Back at school, my eyes were locked on the elementary school hill, but I did not see her car anywhere. I could feel it in my stomach that something was not right. After another 10 minutes, I was the last student in the parent pickup area. By 3:20, my mom arrived at the police station and called my dad to tell him she could not pick me up. So he sent my grandmother. The teacher supervising the parent pickup area glanced at me for a few minutes like she was contemplating what to do. Then she asked, "Do you want to wait inside?" I sat in one of the office chairs for a while before my grandmother arrived. She took me to get food, but all I wanted was my mom. Although I did not realize it then, That day changed my life for the next decade because I started to live with my father permanently. The relationship I had with my mother changed, and I became stronger. And so, from that one free write, this student was able to develop a clear causal chain. And you can see from her thesis statement that she was able to come to three clear things that changed because of that one event. And so, because she was able to connect to the schema that existed from that experience, she was able to then write a beautiful causal analysis using narration to explain a causal chain. So the primary pattern of development in her paper is still cause and effect, right? But she used narration to do that. And so in that standard, which I think is one of the most difficult maybe for us as teachers to wrap our mind around, the idea of how does narration fit into academic writing, this is the goal. It's for students to be able to use narration to develop one of those academic causal analysis, comparison and contrast, process analysis, one of those more academic patterns of development or rhetorical modes, whichever you want to call them. But you have to help students get there in order for them to be able to do that level of thinking and convey that effectively in writing.
Rebecca, I think we can safely say, and just from the proof is in the pudding, this student's final draft shows the process because of the scaffolding that was done to give her a skill. This is where she ended. And we sometimes want kids to jump to this simply because of on-demand writing. We know it's a timed session, but we have to, in the classroom, teach them how to do it first. They cannot get to the point this young lady got to in writing without the skills that this strategy led her to. And, you know, the student work is, the final student work is always the evaluation to use for the strategy itself. And I think this speaks for itself.
And that, Carol, is an excellent point. If you want students to, because realistically and theoretically, I think that on-demand writing, the intention behind it originally, and I have no idea if I'm right about this, but it's the only thing I can come to that makes sense, is that if students have been trained and they are writing all the time in the classroom, that they can call up some of those skills to be a proficient writer in a timed setting. And so you have to teach them in an untimed setting first.
Can't put the cart before the horse.
Exactly.
All right, we're ready to close this session out, and as you can see, there is a link that says Access Resources At, and this is where you will find resources for all 10 videos that we are doing for all 10 interdisciplinary practices, with the exception of this one. And also practice 1, because we have embedded them right within the PowerPoint and the video. So you're not going to find anything extra there unless I, acquire more strategies. But always please go back to this folder, because I intend to keep populating it with resources as often as I can and as often as they come up. So thank you for being with us, and we will be back with more videos on the literacy practices.